You are not dreaming yet, but you are close. You lie still and the quiet fan-humming lights dimmed the room soft and warm, like a cocoon of comfort, and slowly, gently we drift somewhere far from now, somewhere cold, wet, and stubbornly you find yourself in a shallow pit of mud. Wood and sandbags, a narrow line of trench dug into the scarred earth of France. The year is 1916, and you are a soldier in the British Expeditionary Force around you. The world is a strange mix of silence and chaos in one moment, birdsong in the next. Artillery, but today, we are not here for explosions or battle plans. We are here for something else entirely food-or. Something that tried to be food before losing the will to live there. Diet of a British soldier in World War I was not built for joy. It was not even built for fullness. It was designed, very specifically, to keep a man alive, not thriving, not smiling, just alive each day. The rations came in tins, sacks, or if the supply lines failed, not at all. Let us begin with the legend of the trenches. Bully beef, the name sounds cheerful, but the reality was less so. This was canned corned beef. Preserved in gelatinous fat, its surface glistened with a translucent layer that wobbled in the cold. The beef itself had the color of dried despair, and the smell of old promises was eaten cold. Spread like regret onto a biscuit, or if one was lucky enough to have a small fire fried until it hissed quietly in protest opening, a tin of bully beef was an act of minor warfare. The key on the side often broke bayonets where used knives snapped. More than one soldier resorted to throwing the beef can against a wall until it surrendered. Alongside the beef came the infamous hardtack biscuit, a small, thick square of baked flour hard as stone, lovingly called toothbreakers or jaw crackers. It was said that some biscuits issued in 1916 had originally been baked for the Boer. Warsome men tried to soften them by soaking them in tea. Others smashed them into crumbs and mixed them into stew, but even then, they retained a kind of fossilized dignity, as if to say, "You will not defeat me." That isly speaking of tea, there was always tea strong black, boiled in battered kettles, balanced on open fires, or heated over candles served in metal cups. Mess tins, or helmets if necessary, was the one constant, the one small comfort, a ritual in the middle of madness. Men drank it before charges. During gas drills, after funerals, in the still moments when the trench fell quiet, the tea had a strength not measured. In caffeine, but in memory, a taste of home, a pause, and the Thunder One officer once remarked, tea had saved more British lives than the steel helmet ever did, of course. Not every day brought the standard rations. Sometimes the supply lines faltered. A shell hit a wagon, rats chewed through the bags, or the mud swallowed the food hole. Then came the improvisation. Stew made from biscuit dust, water from the trench. Shreds of bully beef, maybe a potato if the cook was feeling generous. It was given names. Trench pudding, Tommy's pie, victory stew, names with more imagination than flavor. There were other items to jam. Usually plum and apple rare. Treasured tins of sardines, cheese that sweated even in the cold, and the occasional bar of chocolate from a Red Cross parcel that arrived like a miracle in brown paper. But one item caused more confusion than joy. McConaughey stew, a tinned mixture of turnips, potatoes, carrots, and fat. It looked like something found in a bog. It tasted like surrender cold. It was a punishment warm. It was a lesser punishment. Yet men ate it because hunger made saints of sinners and chefs of the desperate times. Frontline, troops went days without proper food. They scraped tins clean with fingers, drank broth made from old bones, or shared a single biscuit between foremen. And always, there were the rats, big ones, bold ones, who knew exactly when the food would arrive. They gnawed through sacks, raided mess kits, and sometimes stared boldly at soldiers in the night, as if to say, "You eat what you want, we'll eat what's left." Despite all this, despite the cold food, the bad teeth, the endless tea, and the unwelcome company of rodents, there was a strange pride in it all. A quiet endurance. Men who joke about their meals, write letters home describing the horrors of stew, and find Ways to make each meal something shared, a moment of humanity between bombardments, because even in a war of mud and steel, food mattered not just as fuel, but as ritual memory, hope, and so the tea boiled, the biscuits cracked, the bully beef slumped onto a plate with a sigh, and the men ate not because they were hungry, but because they had to, and because somewhere under the grime and smoke they were still human. Close your eyes. Let the room grow quieter. Let the weight of the day slip gently off your shoulders. Now imagine a different silence, not peaceful, but tense. The kind that sits between artillery barrages, where every breath feels too loud, every spoonful of soup sounds like a shout in the mud. This is France, the Western Front, and you are sitting in a dugout, wrapped in a coat that still smells of gunpowder, trying to decide whether your bread is only stale or already fossilized. The French soldier, the poilu, fought with a mustache, a rifle, and a powerful sense of culinary pride, even in the mud, even under threat of gas and falling sky. French soldiers tried to keep one thing alive: the meal lit began. Always with bread pain de campagne, a dark, heavy country loaf delivered in long sacks by mule or truck, sometimes fresh, usually not. But it was French, and that mattered, even when it bent rather than broke. Even when the crust cracked like old timber, it was bread, and that meant something. With the bread came cheese, hard or soft, depending on luck, sometimes strong enough to fight back when unwrapped, a flavor that filled the air and cleared out nearby vermin. There was canned meat, less frequent than in the British trenches, but still part of the ration, usually pork or beef, suspiciously uniform in shape. A rectangle of compressed mystery beans were common to white, soft and swimming in brine, not elegant but filling, especially when mashed into the bread or scooped cold from the tin. But the true star of the French ration was wine. Even at the front lines, even during bombardments, even after burying friends, French soldiers received a daily wine ration, often half a liter, not fine Bordeaux, not aged, just wine reed. Rough and relit, was poured into metal cups, sometimes mixed with water, sometimes swallowed straight, sometimes sipped slowly as the sun set behind. Barbed wire, the wine gave no illusions. It was not for flavor. It was for memory, for routine, for morale. Reminded a man he was still French, still human, still tethered to something beyond the dirt and noise. So powerful was this link that generals worried more about wine shortages than missing ammunition. A dry canteen could cause more complaints than a broken rifle. Some joked that the poilu could withstand any horror. As long as his bread was hard, his cheese was louder than the rats, and his cup was never empty. Meals were not just consumed, they were crafted. Improvised stoves were built from shell casings. Tin cans became frying pans. Men heated soup over candles, boiled coffee in helmets, stirred stew with bayonets. One soldier turned an old mess tin into a fondue pot, another roasted onions on a wire strung over a lantern. Flame. There was pride in this, in making food an act of rebellion, a refusal to let war dictate every part of life. And when the rations failed, as they sometimes did, men turn to barter trade or invention. A few potatoes from a passing farmer, a scrap of meat smuggled from the rear, sometimes even a fish pulled from a stream between shell craters. Stew was the universal fallback. A little water, a little meat, a lot of hope. Some added herbs if they had them, or just told stories about flavor to make it seem present. Even when food was short, meals were long. Slow, intentional men sat in groups, passed bread down the line, clinked their cups, and gave names to dishes that barely deserved them. They laughed grimly, sometimes, but still they laughed, because in those moments there was warmth, not just from the food, but from the ritual, the routine, the shared history written in crumbs and empty cans. The French army fed its soldiers with mixed success, but those soldiers, they fed each other with memory, with presence, with pride. And so in the mud, in the wet, in the smoke and rain and ruin, a crust of bread, a square of cheese, and a half-liter of wine could feel like civilization itself. Breathe slowly, let your shoulders loosen the room. Quiet your body, still. Now picture the sound of boots, heavy, precise. Marching through frost-bitten earth, under a sky that does not remember blue, is the German front in the early days of the Great War. Before the mud had fully swallowed the dreams of empire, before the blockade turned abundance into invention. And you are a soldier in Feldgrau, standing in line for rations that still make sense. At first, the German military was prepared. Not just for war, but for the feeding of it. The early trench kitchens smelled of smoked sausage and boiling potatoes. Bread was dark and dense, thick with rye made to last to resist moisture time. Shelfer coffee brewed hot and black poured into battered tin cups that burned fingers in the winter air. The bread was strong, the meat real, the stews filled with fat, and memory. Some said it felt like home. If you closed your eyes and ignored the barbed wire, the rations were planned with order, with charts, with weights and measures. Meat, beans, dried vegetables, sauerkraut, all carefully shipped, filed, distributed. But then the world began to close. The Allied blockade tightened, ships stopped arriving. Warehouses thinned, and the German soldier met a new word. Ersatz, replacement, but not equal, never equals Satz. Coffee made from acorns, chicory, roasted barley. It smelled vaguely of burnt dreams and tasted like a memory that forgot its name. Ersatz bread, still black, still brick-like, but now filled with potato starch, sometimes sawdust, sometimes hope, pressed into Ersatz meat. If it was meat at all, canned, compressed gray labels, vague or missing contents, unknowable. And yet the soldiers ate because they had to, because hunger is louder than suspicion. Fat became currency. A spoonful of bacon grease could buy loyalty. Trade for boots, even ammunition. Potatoes held the line, cabbage filled the gaps. Stews thickened with flour, and silence. Even at the worst field kitchens found a weight in ovens buried in the dirt. Pots boiling over open flames, helmets used as pans, bayonets. As skewers, one man fried sausage on a shovel heated over a candle. It tasted like smoke, and defiance. German soldiers remained organized. Even as meals grew smaller and stranger, they bartered with civilians, foraged mushrooms, picked berries from hedgerows. During brief moments of quiet, some raised rabbits in secret, others grew herbs in empty shell casings. Every scrap of flavor became sacred still. The change was clear. What once was sausage became ersatz sausage, and that more than any headline told. The story of a war that would not end by 1918. Rations were thin soups, thinner, and morale slipping alongside the calories. Men fought hungry, marched weak, dreamed of real bread, of fat that didn't come from a tin of coffee, that was more than just brown liquid. But still they ate together in silence, in song, with grim jokes and broken spoons. Food became a ritual of memory, a form of resistance, because even when the stomach cried, the soldier endured on. So the pots kept boiling, the bread kept breaking, the ersatz kept arriving, and the German trench, hungry, sour, tired, remained standing. Let your breathing grow slower. The night deepened, the hum of sleep approach. And in that calm, we drift again into the past, this time to a front line that stretched from the Carpathians to the Alps, where frost and fog met men from across a sprawling empire. Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Slovenes, Croats, Germans, each with their own name for hunger, each with their own idea of what dinner should be. But in the trench they shared one thing. The pot, the Austro-Hungarian trench kitchen, was not a single unit. It was an uneasy alliance. Cook from Moravia stirred barley into soup for soldiers from Bosnia. A Hungarian officer demanded paprika. A Czech private quietly wished for dumplings that would never come. What united them all was compromise and lard, lots of lard. Let us begin with the constant: black bread, dense, dark, often sour. It came in large loaves, sometimes molded, sometimes frozen, always heavy. The kind of bread that could double as a weapon or a building material, depending on the weather. Next, soup, always soup, thin, warm, unquestioned. It was the solution to every logistical problem. What's left in the cart? Boil it: beans, barley, potatoes, peas, a single carrot, a bone saved from last week. Everything went in the result Eintophoon pate name that said it all if a man was lucky. There might be a piece of meat if he was very lucky. He did not need to ask what it used to be. Meat was rare when it arrived. It was sometimes horse, sometimes mystery. Sometimes so overcooked it could not remember its own origin, but the fat remained lard. Was used for everything, spread on bread, melted into soup, swallowed straight when times were hard, calories mattered. More than flavor, more than memory, more than traditions, still in stolen moments, tradition whispered back. Hungarian soldiers longed for goulash. They hoarded paprika in small cloth bags, sprinkled it into whatever was boiling, transformed gray stew into something warmer. Czechs missed dumplings, Slovenians craved cabbage rolls. Poles remembered pierogi with a quiet ache, but the trench cook had little to work with, and less time he boiled, he stirred. He did not ask questions. Supplies came late or not at all, sometimes rerouted, sometimes forgotten, sometimes exploded before arrival men shared what they had traded: bread for onions. Swap tobacco for a scrap of meat. A soldier might give up his boots for a real egg. Some units managed to forage roots dug from frozen fields, mushrooms picked in secret, milk bartered from a wary farmer's cow, were moments rare but real. When someone made something close to home, a Slovak stew, a Croatian flatbread, a Transylvanian roast cooked in a rusted pan over a trench fire, these meals did not last, but they mattered not for the calories, but for the memory. Because in a trench where no one spoke the same dialect, food became the only shared language. Oven coffee was not quite coffee, often made from roasted grain, beet pulp, or whatever the quartermaster insisted was a stimulant, was dark, hot, and bitter, but still it was served in tin cups, passed down the line, swallowed in silence, like the war itself. Hand through it all, the soldiers endured, not with joy, but with a kind of quiet resilience, because even if the empire was crumbling, even if the bread was hard, even if the soup was made of nothing in particular, the men still gathered, still ate, still shared on. That in its way was a kind of victory. Let the silence stretch a little longer, the air, still the moment thick with calm now. Imagine a wind, not the soft whisper of a fan, but a cutting, endless wind that moves through your coat, your boots, your bones. This is Russia. In the winter of war, and you are a soldier standing watch. In the frost the sun is weak. The ground is ice, and the bread in your pack is harder than the rifle in your hands. The Russian trench was often less a trench and more a frozen ditch, poorly dug, barely lined. Sometimes simply a hole in the earth and snow. The food was as harsh as the landscape. Black bread, dense, sour, heavy with rye. It came in large bricks, often frozen solid. To eat it, you did not cut, you hacked with bayonets, with knives, with whatever could split the crust without snapping your wrists. Soldiers chewed slowly, carefully, hoping not to break a tooth or a mood. Then there was solid cured pig fat, no seasoning, no disguise, just thick white slices of pure lard cut into blocks, eaten cold, held between frozen fingers. Bitten like a candy bar made of salt and survival. It was high in calories, it stayed good in the cold, and it filled the stomach for a while, but it was not pleasure, it was endurance. The Russians also ate kasha, buckwheat porridge, when they could, a grayish, lumpy bowl of warmth and weight, boiled in battered pots, scooped into metal bowls, sometimes served with scraps of meat. Sometimes alanet was bland, but filling, and when you were deep in the snow with nothing else, that was enough. Cabbage soup was common to shy, a thin liquid, often made from pickled cabbage, sometimes with a carrot, sometimes with a potato, sometimes with hope. When it had meat, it was a feast. When it did not, it was still hot, which mattered more than anything. The Russian soldier drank tea when possible, served black and strong, brewed from loose leaves or from bricks of compressed dust, boiled in kettles, heated in helmets, swallowed fast before it froze in the cup in vodka. When available, not as a ration, but as a ritual shared. Before attacks, after funerals, on cold nights, on colder mornings, numbed it, warmed it, rined it, remind it, was rare. When it came, it was usually tough, grisly, and anonymous. Soldiers did not ask what it was. only if it was some found bones in the soup a welcome. Sign something to chew, something to believe in the supply lines where long, poorly managed, frequently broken trains stopped. Wagons vanished, food arrived, spoiled, or never arrived, and also soldiers foraged, looted, begged boiled, bark ate grass shared. Moldy bread passed down from the officer's tent. Some cases they ate horses without ceremony, without hesitation, one man wrote in his diary. That he would rather eat his boots than another week of frozen fat later, he boiled his boots and still. They endured because the Russian soldier was built to survive on little train. To expect less raised on hunger food was not joy. It was fuel, a ration of faith. A bite of loyalty to a motherland that could not always bite back in, and that there was. Strength even when there was no meal, even when the bread was rock. Even when the fat was gone, the Russian soldier ate what there was. And when there was nothing, he waited until there was something again. Take another breath, let your body relax just a bit more, and drift now. To the 1940s, 2 tents, 2 foxholes, 2 mess kits clanging in tired hands. This is not muddy France in 1916, but maybe Northern Africa, maybe a forest in Belgium, maybe a jungle in the Pacific, but always there is a soldier opening a cannon. The Second World War food had evolved not always for the better, but certainly for the sake of movement. The British soldier now carried rations with letters Type A, Type B, Type C, each one. A box, a calculation, a guess at what might keep a man standing for one more day. The contents canned meat, still a constant. Now more politely named in sausages, meat stew, steak, and kidney pudding, pale rectangles that could bounce if dropped hand. Of course, biscuits still dense, still dry, still best softened in teat, always tea now, powdered now instant. Now served with small sugar cubes and evaporated milk if supplies allowed it. Was drunk in the middle of firefights in the backs of trucks. In the quiet before dawn, still hot, still sacred, and chocolate, now officially part of rations. Sometimes a bar of dark sweetness, wrapped in foil, eaten slowly. A square at a time or swallowed whole in one greedy bite before a march the Americans had. Their own system, the Karashina compact box, easy to carry, hard to forget breakfast. Lunch, dinner each contained a can, a biscuit, a powdered drink, sometimes chewing gum, sometimes a cigarette. Always a surprise cans of ham and eggs that jiggled in a way. Nature never intended processed cheese spread that refused to melt meat hash that resembled neither meat nor hash, but filled the stomach just enough to march. There was spam, so much spam, pink, shiny, unapologetic. It was fried, eaten cold, mashed into. Bread mocked, celebrated, endlessly consumed. Yet despite the packaging, despite the chemistry, soldiers made meals out of it. They boiled coffee in tin cups, fried meat on vehicle hoods, baked in field ovens made from empty drums and leftover wire. GI once made pancakes from flour. Water and imagination. A British corporal turned ration biscuits into something almost like crumble. With jam from a supply crate and a small stolen can of condensed milk even. The Germans by the Second War had shifted to tinned meat, tinned. Fish crackers, instant soup, and ersatz again, though this time the word was quieter, less dramatic. Still present, they ate black bread, still sour, still dependable. Still used as plate. Weapon and metaphor on the Eastern Front rations were often frozen by the time they reached the line. The soup was ice, the meat a brick. The fat, a chisel. Russian soldiers in World War II still carried salo, still ate kasha, still drank tea from battered kettles, still boiled cabbage in battered pots, still watched the sky and waited for bread. There were differences, of course, more factories, more packaging, more science, but also more mouths, more movement, more fronts, more chaos. So the meals remained. Simple, portable filling, because food in war is never just food. It is heat, it is weight, it is a connection to home, to memory, to the part of a man that still wants to sit. Hold a fork and forget where he is. Take a deep breath, let your mind wander. Again, not to the sounds of marching or gunfire, but to the soft sizzle of fat. In a mess tin, the clink of a spoon against metal. The whisper of warm bread pulled from a coat pocket, because even in war, even in the mud, even under fire, men found ways. To cook, not just eat, but cook. Imagine a trench somewhere in Italy, a German foxhole in a Belgian forest, a British outpost in North Africa. An American soldier crouched behind a tank in France. In each of these places, there is someone making something. That isn't just rations, it's comfort memory, a quiet defiance. A soldier with nothing but a tin of meat and a pocket knife. Turning it into a stew by adding biscuit crumbs and hot water, another one heating canned beans on the engine block of Takester. A tank waiting patiently for the warmth to spread. Some wore their mess kits strapped to their packs. Others carried small pans inside their coats. Used helmets to boil water, used bayonets as skewers, used tin cans as stoves, lighting a fire in the bottom, piercing holes for air, balancing the ration on top like a sacred offering. There was no recipe. Only instinct. Add what you have. Heat it any way you can share it, if possible. Eat it all before someone else smells it in the British lines. A few soldiers tried to recreate breakfast with tinned bacon, biscuits, and strong tea, not because it tasted like home, but because it made the morning feel less like war. In the American camps, soldiers made peanut butter sandwiches from ration crackers, stirred powdered coffee with rifle cleaning rods, and hoarded chocolate bars like treasure. Some saved sugar cubes, others saved jam tins. Some kept a single boiled sweet in their pocket for days, eating it slowly as if it were made of gold. In Italy, German troops dug small ovens from mud and rock-baked hard bread until it was warm again. Dried herbs they foraged from the countryside, crumbled them into stew as though flavor could make fear go away. French soldiers lit candles under empty tin. Cans heated water for soup, made onion broth from scraps, sometimes added a clove of garlic hidden in a sock for weeks. On the Eastern Front, Russian soldiers boiled beetroot, made thick red soup in battered pots, used whatever they could, often nothing at all, but still managed to make something warm. Even when the ingredients were gone, the ritual remained. There were rules. Unspoken but sacred: always stir, always taste, never waste, always share if you can, because a hot meal, even one made of scraps, and silence could warm more than the body. Some of the meals were strange, unholy combinations, born of desperation. Jam mixed with beef tea, poured over biscuits and cheese. Beans eaten with chocolate spread, but to those who made them, they were perfect. Soldiers gave their dishes names: mocking, affectionate, prideful victory, stew, trench pudding, foxhole fondue, engine roast, shell shock, surprise. They told each other these were family recipes, secret traditions passed down from uncles. No one had ever met. They laughed, sometimes forced, but always together, because food, even bad food, especially bad food, was something they could still control. A hot bite of something could make a cold night pass faster, could make the war wait a little longer before finding you again. In the end, it wasn't just about calories or warmth or survival. It was about preserving the part of themselves that didn't wear a uniform, that wasn't a rank, that wasn't a target. It was about feeling human for a moment. For a mouthful, for a meal cooked on a helmet, shared under the stars. Segment 7 complete. Let me know when to begin. Segment 8, the final segment where we reflect on what it meant to feed a war, to eat through chaos, and how memory so often tastes like what was eaten when everything else was broken. Understood. Now we come to the end. Not the end of war, but the end of this quiet journey through kitchens without walls, meals without recipes, and soldiers who learned to eat in the shadow of collapse. Let the breath slow, the muscles soften, and let this final segment be a gentle closing of the lid on a pot that simmered across continents. Segment 8, the taste of memory. Why soldiers never forgot the food of war. Close your eyes, imagine silence. But not peace, just the absence of gunfire, smoke hanging in the air, the last spoonful swallowed in a trench that might not be there tomorrow. Now imagine what you remember if you survived, if you came home. Would it be the taste of meat in a tin? The steam from a helmet of soup, the sound of dry biscuits cracking between your teeth, or the bitter warmth of tea sipped in a crater. Soldiers don't always remember battles, not clearly, not all of them. But they remember meals or the lack of them. Food becomes the marker, the calendar, the ritual that made each day feel like it had a beginning and an end, a stale crust of bread shared with a friend who never came back, a bar of chocolate eaten alone in a foxhole soup that burned your mouth. Because you were in such a hurry to feel anything warm that becomes memory, because food isn't just what fills the stomach, it's what anchors you. To the moment, to yourself, to someone you loved. Many veterans wrote about it later, not the guns. But the bread, not the pain, but the pudding they invented from army crackers and jam. One British soldier said he could still taste the tea. 30 years after the war, he remembered how it felt in his chest, how he held the tin cup with shaking hands. Not from fear, but because his fingers had forgotten what warmth felt like. An American veteran kept a can of Spam on his shelf. Not to eat, but because it had fed him, and it reminded him of being 19 in France. Hungry Alive German memoir spoke of ersatz coffee, mocked it, but also mourned it, because it was the only thing that was always there. In the morning, at night, even when everything else had fallen away. Some Russian soldiers remembered Sallow with a grim smile. It was fat, it was hard. It was real, and it was there when nothing else was. French soldiers years later would still pour cheap red wine into tin cups, toast the friends they lost, and the bread they once dipped in stew made of mystery and hope. The Austro-Hungarian veterans. Those from vanished nations remembered the Eintaf, the one-pot meals where everyone, no matter the language, scooped from the same pot. A kind of unity that no emperor could enforce, and always there was sharing a spoon passed from one man to another. A biscuit split in half, a sip of tea offered without asking. Food was rationed, but kindness was not. These meals, these scraps, these boiling pots under canvas, became the last thing many soldiers had before a charge, before a shell, before silence. And for those who came back, the taste stayed, not because it was good, but because it was real. Because when everything else was stripped away, a mouthful of something warm could still make a man feel like he might see another morning. Let your breathing settle, let the soft hum of sleep follow you again, because now we follow a trail of steam rising from a field kitchen in a muddy clearing. Somewhere far from the newspapers, but close to every hungry soldier. This is the story of the people who made war edible: the army, cook, the quartermaster, the mess sergeant. The kitchen crew that stirred stew instead of firing shots, but fed more soldiers than any weapon ever could. They. Military kitchen was a strange place, part tent, part factory, part miracle. Every day it had to do the same thing: feed men who had burned off thousands of calories, marching, fighting, freezing, waiting too. The soldier, a plate of food just arrived, hot or not, good or not, it came. Behind it, there was a chain of systems, sometimes broken, sometimes brilliant, always under pressure. Start with the British Army's field kitchens, metal containers, wheeled ovens, rolling cookhouses pulled by horses or small trucks. Sometimes they sat a mile from live. HML from the front, sometimes much closer inside. There was fire grease, noise, steam rising from huge pots filled with meat, stew, beans, or sometimes just tea. Endless gallons of tea. One cook could serve 200 men with the help of a few assistants armed with wooden spoons longer than their arms and aprons that were never cleaned. They cooks worked in shifts from before dawn to long after dark. Always preparing, always boiling, always stirring. They did not complain much because they knew if they failed, the whole unit would fail. A fed soldier could march, could fight, could think. Hungry soldier could noten. The American Army, the mess sergeant, was a king, a feared, respected, slightly greasy king. He controlled the food, the schedule, and the mood of the company. He kept inventory, scouted for stolen tins, knew where the good butter was hidden. Could make powdered eggs taste almost like something that had once been an egg. He knew every trick, used bacon grease to make gravy. Stretched meat with breadcrumbs. Fried dough from leftover flour and sugar, tossed in raisins when he had them, or boiled coffee thick enough to stand on its own. American. Field kitchens were boxy steel, built to fold up and roll out fast. They were packed with canned meat, powdered milk, dried potatoes, and coffee. Always coffee. A team of cooks worked with military precision, boiling water, baking biscuits, organizing trays, and yelling at anyone who came too close before serving. Timing Germany. The field kitchen was called the Gulaschkano, the goulash cannon, a huge metal wagon with a chimney that looked like a piece of artillery. But cooked, instead of killed, it could feed hundreds. It could be moved anywhere. And it could make stew from almost anything: potatoes, meat, sauerkraut, beans, lentils, sometimes all in the same pot. Was usually parked just behind the line, hidden by trees. Watched carefully, because losing it meant losing the unit's stomach. Russian field kitchens were often improvised old carts, metal drums, holes dug in the snow and lined with stone. Fuel was precious, so was food, so they made the fire small and the pots big. The cooks used what they had: grain, water, salt, fat, if they were lucky, and sometimes they weren't cooks at all, just whoever knew how to light a fire and didn't mind standing in smoke for hours. And all these kitchens, the tools were the same: huge pots, ladles, buckets, knives, sacks of flour, tins of meat, jars of jam when available. And one secret weapon: organization. A good kitchen kept time, measured everything, tracked every serving, kept soldiers lined up, not too hungry, not too full, just enough. There were rules, rations, schedules, but also there was creativity. Cooks swapped ingredients between units, traded for herbs, snuck in onions or garlic, made birthday cakes from crushed biscuits and jam, fried dough in oil saved from bacon, stirred soup with spoons that had been bayonets the day before. They did what they had to feed the line, because the soldier needed more than bullets. He needed bread and salt and warmth, even when shells fell, even when trucks broke, even when the cold froze, the butter solid and bent the ladles in half. Still, the cooks boiled on. They are rarely remembered. Their names not carved on memorials. Their recipes not passed down, but without them, nothing else would have worked. Let the breath soften the thought slow. Now picture a street somewhere in London or Berlin or Brooklyn. The curtains are drawn. The windows are taped against glass shatter. And in the kitchen, someone is boiling cabbage again. During the Second World War, civilians faced their own version of survival. Without rifles, but still under threat. Bombings, shortages, empty shops, and ration books that became more important than coins. In Britain, food rationing began in 1940. It was not just about scarcity. It was about fairness, control, and making sure no one hoarded, while others starved. Each person received a ration book, inside stamps and coupons, divided by food, group: sugar, butter, meat, tea, eggs. The weekly allowance might include a few ounces of cheese, 2 rashers of bacon, 3 pints of milk, 1 egg, sometimes dried, sometimes powdered fresh. Vegetables were not rationed, but they were unpredictable and not always available. So the government launched the Dig for Victory campaign. Lawns were turned into gardens, public parks became cabbage patches. Families grew carrots in flower beds, potatoes in buckets, onions in old coal boxes. Garden became the new supermarket. If you could grow it, you could eat it. People shared tips: how to compost, how to trap pests, how to store turnips over winter. Children learned to plant and harvest and help peel mountains of unfamiliar roots for dinner. There was also the Ministry of Food, a real office with real pamphlets and real radio shows. Taught people how to stretch meat, use lentils, make mock sausage, and turn stale bread into pudding. There was no waste. Peelings went into soup. Drippings from meat were saved in jars. Cheese rinds were boiled to flavor broth. Housewives became ration artists, finding ways to keep meals balanced and morale strong. Recipes changed, adapted, bent to what was left. Shepherd's pie, made with lentils instead of lamb. Fish cakes without fish. Woolton pie, named after a minister, made from root vegetables with no pastry, only mashed potato. And still people called it dinner in Germany. Civilians faced similar pressures as the war deepened. Imports dropped and Allied bombings damaged supply chains. Bread became darker, more rye, less wheat, sometimes sawdust or ground acorns. were added to stretch the flour meat was rare butter, scarcer still sugar a memory. And coffee, replaced with roasted barley or chicory children, were fed first, then the elderly, then workers' women waited in long queues, stood with ration cards clutched. In cold fingers, hoping for a little extra this week, a new shipment, a miracle in the United States. Rationing was introduced in 1942, but supplies were better, more stable, more plentiful than in Europe still. Americans gave up luxuries to send food overseas. 2 troops, 2 allies, 2 war zones, coffee, sugar, butter, gasoline, all under restriction, every family had ration stamps. Every meal had to follow the guidelines, and so they adapted meatless Mondays, wheatless Wednesdays recipes. Made from local produce, seasonal. Swaps women learned how to can vegetables, store fruit, stretch flour with cornmeal bake cakes without eggs or sugar using mashed potatoes. Or fruit syrup. They grew their own gardens to victory gardens behind schools, beside churches, even on rooftops. By 1943, over 20 million victory gardens were feeding American families. My idea was simple. If you grow your own, you free up resources for the troops. And it worked. There was pride, not just sacrifice. A participation civilians became soldiers in their own way, fighting with aprons and spades instead of rifles and tank sand in those kitchens. There were stories, children asking why there were no bananas, men trading coffee beans like treasure. Grandmothers making jam from beets and calling it dessert. The food was plain, but the effort behind it was extraordinary. It was not just survival, it was contribution, a way to feel connected to those at the front. Because when you stirred a pot of soup that used the same dried peas, the same powdered milk that your son might be eating in a trench far away, you felt less helpless. You felt part of something, a nation, a cause, a fight that went beyond guns, and that was nourishment too. Take a deep breath and let your thoughts drift into stillness, a stillness filled with waiting and watching, and wondering if a crate of food might arrive before your strength disappeared. Prisoners of war in World War I and World War II were not left to starve, not always, but they were rarely fed well. The Geneva Convention made promises, but war, as always, had a way of forgetting paperwork. Begin with the British and Commonwealth soldiers captured during World War II in camps across Europe, Germany, Poland, Austria. They waited behind barbed wire wearing uniforms, now patched, faded, fraying at the seams. Each day they lined up for food. If it came, German camp rations were standardized, but minimal black bread, usually heavy sometimes. Moldy thin soup, made from cabbage or potatoes, or little more than warm water, sometimes margarine, a cube of sugar. A few spoonfuls of barley or beans, enough to keep a man alive, not enough to keep him strong. But then there were the parcels. Red Cross parcels sent by ship, by train, by hope boxes that arrived like treasure chests, carrying not just calories, but moral inside. Powdered milk tins of corned beef, chocolate, sugar, biscuits, sometimes cigarettes or soap. Each box could feed a man for a week. If it wasn't stolen, confiscated, or lost in transit, the parcels were shared, traded, guarded. Some were split among friends. Others hoarded, kept for birthdays or bribes, or the moments when hunger felt too large to ignore. American posts received similar packages when they arrived their camps. Much like the British, depended on where they were, who was in charge, and what supply lines could still function through bombed-out rails in many places. Food meant a morning ladle of weak soup, a chunk of bread, an occasional spoon of jam. If the guards were generous or distracted. In Japanese prison camps, conditions were often worse. Geneva was a rumor, not a rule. The meals, sparse and cruel, a bowl of rice, sometimes boiled, sometimes not. A few strands of pickled vegetable if available. No meat, no sugar, no warmth. Men lost weight, teeth, hope. They gathered grass, boiled weeds, scraped burnt rice from the bottom of pots, and called it a second helping. And still, they survived because even the smallest bowl, the weakest broth, became a lifeline. Some men kept spoons hidden in socks, used tin cans as bowls. A flattened helmet became a frying pan. Scraps of cloth were stitched into tea towels, even if there was no tea meals, became ceremony slow, careful, reverent, because there might not be another tomorrow or another serving some camps. Saw gardens, small ones, built by prisoners tended with devotion. Tiny green patches where potatoes or carrots pushed through frost others. Saw rats caught, skinned, cooked. The lines between. Hunger and survival grew thinner by the day, but prisoners adapted. They created recipes from memory, told each other about family dishes, described feasts they once ate using only words as if description could trick the stomach into feeling full. Wine. Man would talk of roast beef, another of curry. Someone else described his mother's bread in such detail. You could almost smell the crust, feel its steam when torn open. This was food too, in a way. Memory meals passed hand to hand, mouth to mouth. Stories told in place of sugar. In Russian camps, German prisoners after the war faced equal misery, fed a diet of watery soup, often spoiled, served in broken bowls, no Red Cross parcels, no letters, no comfort. They dug roots, traded for crusts, fought over scraps, and yet those who lived remembered the meals, the clearest steak crust given by a guard, a stolen onion, a bowl of soup with real potato. A feast because hunger unifies levels. Minute takes away the ranks, the sides, the reasons for war, replaces them with a simple desires to survive, to eat, to keep a spoon, to hope that tomorrow brings another bowl. Imagine a night without lamps, a house without windows, a world without noise. Now picture a pot hung low over a small flame, its contents stirring slowly, carefully hidden beneath rags and soot, because even the smell of stew could give away your position. During the Second World War, the resistance fought not just with weapons, but with food. In France, in Poland, in the Balkans, in Norway, in Greece. Partisans lived between the trees, among broken buildings, and in the backs of homes where the front door was always bolted twice. They did not have rations. They did not have supply chains. They had hunger and what they could find, steal, grow, or be given. A resistance fighter's meal was often foraged wild onions, roots, mushrooms from wet logs, leaves gathered at dawn, and herbs that survived beneath the snow. Protein was rare, but they hunted, trapped small animals. Sometimes a rabbit, sometimes a bird, and on special nights, a goat taken from an abandoned field. Bread, if they had it, was sacred, carried wrapped in cloth, broken, slowly shared equally, even if there wasn't enough to go around. In some places, local villagers brought food in secret. A sack of potatoes left under a log, a tin of beans buried in the straw, a single egg wrapped in wool tucked in the pocket of a child's coat hand, so the meals were assembled in bits, in parts. A stew that tasted like survival. A soup where salt was a luxury. They cooked without smoke if they could. Covered flames with rocks, boiled water in hollowed logs used. Rusty cans for kettles and flat stones for frying time did not allow slow cooking. Bombs, patrols, dogs, all could ruin a meal or end a life, so they ate quickly when they could, sometimes cold, sometimes raw, always alert. In Poland, the resistance cooked in cellars using chimneys that no longer reached the roof, lining their fires with wet clay to dampen the glow, to muffle the crackle. They made thin porridge, sometimes from oats, sometimes from crushed seeds, sometimes from whatever the flour wants. Wasn't if there was a little meat, it was stretched, boiled, dried, cut into slivers so thin they melted on the tongue before the brain could taste them. In Yugoslavia, partisans cooked in caves, warmed stones first, then layered stewpots on top, covered them with wet cloth to trap both heat and sentand. In Greece, the resistance baked flatbread in ash, covered it with leaves, carried it between villages under bundles of laundry. Every region they gave food names, not for nutrition, but for courage, victory. Bread, freedom, soup, revenge, stewnet, because they were grand, but because the act of naming made the food more than calories. It made it sacred. Sometimes meals were ruined by a burst of gunfire, a sudden evacuation, the sound of a boot outside the door. Ruther times a small feast was possible. 2 eggs, a chunk of cheese, boiled greens, wine from a hidden cellar. Laughter, soft, tired But reland, they ate together in circles, in silence, in unity, because food in those hidden places was a reminder of the world. Before the war end, the world they hoped would return some. Resistance cooks became legendary, known not just for their bravery, but for what they could make from almost nothing. A woman in Brittany, who turned parsnips and dry herbs into broth that lifted spirits after a failed Ray Day teenage boy in Ukraine who made pancakes from cornmeal and tree sap, sweetened with ash and boiled fruit skins. All men in the Italian mountains, who taught fighters to preserve wild garlic so they would have flavor. Even when hope ran dry, their recipes were not written down, but they lived in the hearts and stomachs of those who fought beside them even years later. Veterans would say, "I remember the bread he made, the soup she stirred, the smell of wild thyme in the dark," because when you fight in silence, when you sleep with boots on, and your only clock is fear, a warm meal, even if it's only a handful of leaves, means everything. Let your thoughts stretch now far across oceans into dusty barracks, tented camps, hot plains, and jungle paths, because this too is the war story. The part told not in rifles, but in rice, in lentils, in flatbreads, cooked over open flame. Millions of men from colonized nations were drafted or volunteered during both world wars. They fought in France, in Burma, in North Africa, in the Pacific, and when they marched, they brought their hunger with them. But what they were given to eat rarely matched what they knew. Take the Indian soldiers, Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, each with distinct dietary rules, each expecting rice dal chapati, or perhaps goat cooked with cardamom and onion. Instead, they found tins of beef, white bread, canned pudding rations made in London. With no understanding of religion or flavor, early on the British Army realized its mistake, not because of compassion, but because the soldiers were starving, and so improvised kitchens were created within camps, behind barracks, on ships crossing the sea. Indian cooks were appointed. Spices were requested. Lentils brought in burlap sacks, grain stored carefully. These kitchens produced food more familiar: rice cooked in vast metal pots, dal thickened slowly over fire, vegetable curries when supplies allowed, spiced with what could be found. Still, it was never quite right. The ghee was missing, the chapatis were too dry, and the meat, when available, often came from animals the men could not eat for reasons the quartermasters never understood. But the cooks persisted. They rolled flatbreads on ammunition crates, cooked stews in shell casings, used bayonets as stirring sticks, and guarded what little turmeric they had like treasure. In East Africa, colonial troops from Kenya, Uganda, and beyond marched under British command, their rations often the same as regular army fare: biscuits, tinned meat, powdered tea. But they too cooked their own way, grinding maize into ugali, boiling greens, roasting plantains when they could find them. The evening smells of garlic and groundnut sauce would drift across camp, softening the edge of fatigue. West African soldiers in the French army, the tirailleurs Senegalais, were often issued European meals: bread, coffee, cheese, but they missed millet peppers, stews rich with palm oil and chili. Now picture a back alley in a bombed-out town, or a train station lit by candle stubs, a corner where two men stand silently, one handing over a tin of meat, the other passing a cigarette or something more valuable. A secret, a favor, a piece of bread, wrapped in newspaper, because in every war there's a second menu, a hidden one where nothing is guaranteed, but anything is possible. The best ration systems failed sometimes. Trucks didn't arrive, trains were bombed, cooks went missing, and men still had to eat. So they turned to what always rises in scarcity: the black market in cities across Europe, from Paris to Warsaw, from Naples to Berlin. A loaf of bread could cost a week's wages, or a bottle of morphine or a wedding ring. Food was hoarded, smuggled, sold, swapped. Farmers kept some back-traded eggs for cloth, cheese for boots, butter for batteries, and in army camps soldiers traded among themselves: a tin of sardines for chocolate, a bar of soap for tea, a slice of meat for a night of peace. Even mess sergeants joined in. They controlled supplies, portions, leftovers. They could make things disappear or appear with a nod, with a handshake. With the right offers, Villians learned quickly where the cooks lived who had connections, who might trade. Extra flour for news or extra potatoes for quiet and occupied France underground food networks flourished butchers who slaughtered without papers. Farmers who kept pigs out of sight. Bakers who used false flour tallies to produce bread that wasn't supposed to exist, and delivery boys who carried cheese beneath baskets of laundry or sausages sewn into coats. Everyone had a methadone. Germany, by the final years of the war, the black market fed more people than the official channels, especially in bombed cities where rubble stood, where shops used to be. People traded heirlooms for butter watches, for coffee, sometimes just the promise of repayment. Sometimes note in Italy, as the war dragged on, the black market became its own society. Food was moved by smugglers. Children carried pasta between checkpoints. Old women sold bottles of cooking oil from carts. Men baked bread in hidden ovens, then sold it by weight. Using bits of broken scale and silent nods, the Soviet Union bartering became law. Farmers traded grain for tools. City dwellers offered services for eggs. A school teacher might tutor a child in exchange for soup, bones, and a few beets. Even in prisoner of war camps, there were unofficial markets. One man might have coffee, another soap, another cigarettes. Each item had a price, a ranking, a logic understood only by the desperate. Sometimes a spoon of jam could be traded for a week's worth of favors. A square of chocolate was treasure. Cooks, when they could, saved scraps, fat from the meat, crumbs from the bread, boiled bones from the stews. They hid them. Sometimes they shared. One soldier wrote of bribing a guard, not with money, but with a cake made from crushed biscuits and dried fruit. It bought an extra blanket and 3 nights of silence. Another recalled trading his boots for a roasted chicken and walking barefoot through snow just to taste meat again. Food bought things that no coin could. A softer bunk, a message home, a pause in the violence. The black market was not fair, but it was real land. For many, it was the only reason they made it to the next morning. Children grew up watching their parents trade jam for fuel, sugar for shoes, old coats for beans. They learned to carry food like secrets, wrapped tight, shared only when it mattered most. And when peace came long after the final battle, people still remembered the taste, not of feast, but of the food that was never meant to exist. The bread traded in an alley, the butter hidden in a coat, the egg passed under a table, the soup eaten in silence, knowing it had cost something more than money, because war does not end hunger. It only changes where the kitchens are and who gets to eat. Close your eyes now. Picture metal walls, narrow hallways, a ceiling so low your shoulders graze the pipes, the sound of water always there, dripping, humming. A reminder that you are surrounded by sea. This is the kitchen at sea, where space is tight. Supplies are finite, and the clock never stops ticking. Battleships, destroyers, submarines, aircraft carriers. Thousands of men served, and every one of them needed to eat in. The navies of World War II. Food was both science and strategy. It had to last, stay edible, and keep morale afloat. A British warship, the galley, ran nearly all day, starting before dawn when the cook lit the stove, warmed the kettles, and prepared a breakfast that would carry men through long shifts. Bacon, beans, fried bread. If the oil held out, and tea, always tea. Then came lunch, often stew thick with potatoes, bits of meat, if lucky, thickened with flour or crushed biscuit. Dinner might be more of the same, but with a pudding boiled in a cloth, served with condensed milk or jam. If the stores had not run dry, the Royal Navy, each sailor had a mess group, a handful of men who cooked together, queued together, and divided each meal between themselves. Bread was baked on board when flour allowed, otherwise they made do. With ship's biscuit, hard, dry, unapologetic. It was meant to last, and it did sometimes to well sailors. Joked it was older than the ship, but they ate it anyway, soaked in tea or crumbled into soup fresh. Fruit and vegetables vanished, quickly stored. In cool areas, consumed within days. After that, it was tinned. Everything tinned. Meat, tinned fruit, tinned custard, monotony in American ships. The meals were more generous, more varied than thanks to better supply lines and bigger budgets breakfast. Might include scrambled eggs, pancakes, or sausage coffee brewed strong with powdered creamer, and enough sugar to keep morale from sinking. Lunch. And dinner followed in cycles: roast beef, canned peas, macaroni, mashed potatoes on aircraft carriers, thousands. Of men ate in shifts, the galleys operated non-stop, and cooks worked in heat grease and constant vibration. There were bakery units, ice cream machines, even soda fountains on some larger vessels. It wasn't luxury, but it was comfort and on a steel deck in the Pacific. Comfort mattered. Then there were the submarines. Deep beneath the surface, food had to be compact, efficient, and tightly packed into every spare corner. In a German U-boat, supplies were stored under bunks inside torpedo tubes between floor panels. Cabbages hung from the ceiling, bread stashed behind control panels, sausage looped over valves the first few days at sea. Meals were almost pleasant: dark rye bread, cold cuts, cheese, butter, but the freshness faded fast by the second week. Mold crept into everything, humidity turned biscuits soft, and the cold cuts became memory still. The cook made do: one man, one hot plate, one mission. He boiled potatoes, made stews from tinned meat, served canned fish with pickles when possible. Meals were eaten elbow to elbow, knees touching, breath fogging the air. No room for ceremony, only hunger. In American submarines, conditions were better: more storage, more variety. Even luxuries. They had fresh eggs, bacon, coffee in abundance, and a legendary midnight meal served to the men coming off shift. It was the highlight of the day: sandwiches, soup, sometimes ice cream. Because even underwater, even in danger, a good sandwich mattered. The cooks were respected, even protected, because they controlled the one thing that made the steel tube bearable: a hot meal in a cold ocean. And when battles came, depth charges above, silent running below. The crew would sit in silence, tensing with each distant boom, while the cook still made stew, because war doesn't pause for dinner. And when the all clear came, the men would eat quietly, slowly, gratefully, sometimes in the dark, sometimes by red emergency light, but always together. They remembered those meals not for the flavor, but for what they meant: that they had made it, that they were still alive. Now picture a hospital cot, a soldier lying still, eyes half closed, bandaged, bruised, drained, and next to him a tray. On that tray, a bowl of broth, a slice of white bread, and maybe, if he was lucky, a little jam in a chipped metal cup. In wartime hospitals, food was not just about survival. It was part of the healing, part of the process of returning a man from war to person. But it was not always easy. In the field hospitals closest to the front, meals were rushed, minimal, and limited by whatever supplies could be dragged across the chaos. British medics might serve weak tea, stale bread, and thin barley soup cooked over a camp stove in a tent with open flaps. While shells boomed in the distance, patients with wounds to the jaw, neck, or chest couldn't chew, so nurses fed them with spoons, dribbled broth between cracked lips, or crushed biscuits into mush and stirred in condensed milk. French field hospitals relied on local produce when possible: simple stews of leeks, carrots, soft root vegetables, boiled gently and served in enamel bowls. Red wine was sometimes used not just for cleaning wounds, but for warming bodies too frail for real food. Din American hospitals, more effort was made toward nutrition science: eggs, milk, cereal, white bread, toast, soft fruits like mashed bananas or stewed apples for soldiers with stomach wounds. Meals became delicate calculations: calories without weight, protein without texture. Cooks learned to make gelatin from meat stock, egg custards with powdered milk purees, from vegetables strained twice until they slid down the throat with no effort. These meals took time and patience and quiet hands. Soldier with a damaged body might eat with a straw, sip from a bowl held by another, or simply smell the food when eating wasn't yet possible. In German hospitals, food depended on the region and the state of the supply chain. At the wars, start recovery diets included soft rye bread, light sausage, potato mash with butter, but by the war's end, it was gruel, watered cabbage, and whatever the kitchens could scrape together. In Soviet hospitals, bread and weak tea were the most common staples. Patients shared whatever meat could be secured, usually fatty cuts boiled into bland soup. Doctors sometimes gave vodka as pain relief as stimulant, or just to make patients sleep in. Japanese military hospitals' rice porridge dominated the trays, simple, white, unflavored, served with pickled radish or miso when available, but for the most wounded, even porridge was a challenge. They were spoon-fed slowly, painfully, by overworked nurses who balanced a dozen patients. And one pot of food that had to stretch nutritional science was in its infancy, but even then, medics knew the wounded who ate recovered faster. So, they coaxed bites, praised sips, celebrated empty bowls. Sometimes they told stories to distract from the pain of swallowing. Sometimes they simply sat and waited for the soldier to try again. There were failures. Some could not eat, could not keep food down, could not recover, but many did, and they remembered what brought them back, not the flavor, but the warmth, the spoonful of soup that didn't burn, the first bite of bread after 3 silent days, the stewed apple that reminded them of home food. In hospitals became a quiet victory, one bite at a time. And when soldiers could eat normally, they were often celebrated. Day full tray meant progress. A slice of toast meant hope. An empty bowl meant maybe, just maybe, you'd be sent home. Let the noise fall silent now and picture a stove, an old one, chipped enamel. 3 burners that still work if you turn the knobs just right. A pot of something warm sits gently on the heat. Maybe beans, maybe barley. Maybe just water and a little hope, because the war came home not with tanks, but with scarcity. During both world wars, civilians faced rationing shortages and endless lines. Food became numbers, books, tickets, stamps. In Britain, every household was issued a ration book. Inside, coupons for meat, butter, sugared tea. Each week, the local grocer would mark what had been taken and how much remained. A single egg, 2 ounces of cheese, 4 ounces of bacon if you were lucky. Families learned to stretch, to swap, to save. Children grew up measuring spoons of powdered milk, boiling carrots instead of potatoes, spreading jam thinner and thinner across toast. And yet, there was pride in it. Posters lined the walls, encouraging citizens to do their bit, make do, and mend. Grow your own waste. Nothing, so they grew. Gardens, victory. Gardens and backyards, parks, even window boxes. Lettuce in flower beds, tomatoes on rooftops, carrots along fence lines. In the kitchen, wartime recipes flourished. Mock meat, mock cream, mock duck, made from lentils wrapped in pastry. Cooks boiled parsnips and sugar to make faux pineapple. Mashed beans into sandwich spreads. Turned stale bread into puddings with a splash of vinegar and dried fruit. It was creative. It was strange, but it filled the plate. In America, rationing was less severe, but still present. Sugar, meat, butter, coffee, all limited down. Like elsewhere, families adjusted. Women attended cooking classes for wartime meals, learned to use every part of a vegetable, saved grease from bacon to flavor soups. Canned fruit at home, so their children could taste peaches. In the winter, cookbooks were published with names like Wartime Meals for the Family Table. Victory, kitchen meals without waste, each recipe designed to use less but feed more. In the Soviet Union, the war kitchen was not tidy. It was desperate. Civilians in cities like Leningrad faced famine. Survival depended on what could be foraged, traded, or quietly obtained. Bread was stretched with sawdust. Soup thickened with potato peel. Some families lived on a cup of grain a day, but still they cooked together in silence, sometimes with tears, but always with resolve. In occupied countries, cooking became quiet defiance. The Netherlands, families hid food under floorboards. Boiled potatoes by candlelight fed resistance. Fighters with half their own rations. In Poland, in Greece, in Belgium, mothers made stews from weeds. Baked bread with ground acorns, and taught their children to eat slowly, because there might not be a second serving. And yet, amid all of this, neighbors shared. When someone had extra, they gave a few onions, a handful of beans, half a loaf wrapped in cloth and left on a doorstep, because hunger wasn't just individual, was communal. And feeding one another, even with very little, was a way to hold the Whirled together while it fell apart. In the evenings, families gathered at small tables, set simply maybe a cloth, maybe just the wood end they ate. Together, sparingly, gratefully, a mother might say, "This is all we have," and a child would nod and say, "It's enough," and it was. Now picture a train station with no trains, a road lined with carts, bundles, children clutching bread that crumbles in their hands. This was not the front line, but it was just as dangerous as war tore across continents. It left millions in motion, civilians. Fleeing bombed cities, entire communities pushed from homes, families broken and reassembled in fields, camps, shelters, ruins, and through all of it. They tried to eat, not to dine, not to cook, not even to taste, just to survive in refugee camps across Europe. Food became a distant concept. Lines stretched long soups. Where thin bread was rare, relief organizations arrived with bags of flour, cans of beans, sometimes chocolate. Always too little meals were prepared in communal pots, sometimes heated by wood. Gathered from destroyed houses, sometimes not heated at all. One tin-fed 10-1 potato became a feast in France, Belgium, Poland. Children waited for the Red Cross trucks, clutching bowls, hoping for something hot, hoping not to be last in occupied territories. The displaced often had nothing but what they could carry. No ration cards, no storage, no access to even the black market. They foraged, dug into frozen soil, boiled grass, ground acorns into bitter flour they stole when they had to, bartered when they could, and waited, always waited for food to come from somewhere. Sometimes it didn't. Eastern Europe, entire villages were emptied. Families packed into cattle cars, shipped across borders without food, without water, some carried bread hidden in coats. Dried apples sewn into sleeves, hard candy to quiet crying children in concentration camps. Food became a weapon. The meals were deliberate starvation, watery soup made from turnip peel, a crust of black bread per day. No salt, no oil, no nourishment. Men weighed half what they had before. Women stopped menstruating. Children, aged without growing the strongest, might steal a second crust. The weak gave theirs away so a sibling might live another day. But still, even in these places, people tried to share. Someone broke a biscuit in half, passed it down the bunk, slid a spoonful of broth across the floor. It was all they had. But it was something. In prisoner of war camps, meals varied by captor. Some prisoners received tins, boiled meat, tea, biscuits. Others received boiled rice or porridge without grain, just cloudy water and steam. Red Cross parcels brought brief relief: chocolate, Spam, milk powder, cigarettes. That could be eaten or traded or saved until things got worse. Letters home often included one request: send food, send something, anything. Even a crumb meant contact, meant hope, meant someone still remembered. In the Pacific, refugees in Burma, in China, in the Philippines, fled through jungles, across rivers, with nothing but rice wrapped in leaves or nothing at all. They foraged, they begged, they starved villages, burned crops, stolen fields, mined, and still they walked and hoped for food beyond the next hill. In Germany, by the end of the war, cities were flattened, and survivors scoured the rubble for food. They called it hamster fartan. Hamster journeys, civilians walking into the countryside, trading heirlooms for potatoes, family jewelry for onions, a bicycle for flour. The war was ending. But the hunger was not tanned. For the displaced, the hunger lasted. Long after the last gun fell silent. In post-war camps, meals were basic: boiled grains, cabbage soup, powdered milk, biscuits. But they were meals, and after so long, that was enough. Let your thoughts settle now, not on a battlefield, but on a kitchen long gone, warm with spices, cluttered with old pans and laughter in another language now. Imagine that kitchen carried in the heart, through war, through exile, through ration books and border checkpoints, because food, real food, is more than fuel. It is memory. During both world wars, people fought to preserve more than life. They fought to preserve who they were, and food was the front line of culture in Italy, even under bombardment. Families still stirred sauces, tomatoes boiled with garlic, oregano, a pinch of salt, even if the pasta was rationed, even if the oil was scarce. The smell mattered. Children grew up watching their mothers substitute ingredients, but never the rhythm. Of the dish, a stew made from lentils instead of veal bread made without yeast, but still shaped the old way. Still baked with a cross on top in France, wartime meals adapted. But did not surrender French cooks learned to improvise to turn turnips. Into tart leeks, into luxury they cooked in basements, in ruined kitchens, on hot plates balanced on brick sand. Still they laid the table with care, a napkin, a crust of bread. A glass of wine, even if it was watered down, because that too was identity. Poland's traditional soups like gurek, made with fermented rye flour, became thinner, less rich, but were still served on Sundays, still stirred the old way. Still tasted like home in Greece. Families stretched chickpeas into falafel replaced meat. With mushrooms used lemon and garlic to flavor even the simplest rice butt. The meals still followed ritual, still came with blessing, still ended with a spoon of honey. If they had any in Jewish communities scattered by war, ritual foods became sacred even. In ghettos, even in camps, families saved flour for matzah, boiled potatoes for Passover, shared eggs when they could. So a child could remember the taste of Shabbat hand. Those who fled to Britain, to Canada, to Argentina carried the recipes in there. Heads brought pickling jars, smuggled seeds in pockets. They cooked their old food with new ingredients and taught their children not just how to eat, but how to, remembering India during the war with rice exports drained by empire and famine sweeping. Bengal families still added turmeric, still toasted mustard seeds, still wrapped food in banana leaves when they had them. Flavor was hope. Even in small doses in African colonies, soldiers and civilians adapted using cassava millet peanuts they learned. To spice the bland rations sent from Europe, turn tinned meat into stew, add chili, add life, because food was never just sustenance. Was language. Heritage Prairie mother in Tunisia taught her daughter how to make couscous without semolina using crushed barley. A man in Shanghai brewed soy sauce from scraps. A girl in Ukraine shaped dumplings with dried cabbage instead of pork. But they all remembered the original land. The memory flavored every bite. Even soldiers carried culture with the man. American GI might trade for tamales in a French village. A Senegalese rifleman might mash sweet potatoes with garlic. A British soldier from Punjab might stir curry powder into stew just to feel a little closer to homeland when letters arrived. They often carried recipes, a reminder, a connection, a way to cook love into survival. Boil the lentils until soft, add the garlic last. Don't forget how your grandfather did it. In displaced persons camps after the war, refugees set up communal kitchens. They baked flatbreads on improvised stoves, made coffee with crushed roasted grain, stewed plums with nothing but sugar and rainwater. And it was enough because it wasn't just about eating. It was about becoming whole again. A spoon of soup that tasted like before, a smell that pulled a name from the dark, a bite that said, I am still me even here, even now. Imagine a kitchen swept clean, the bomb dust brushed away, the kettle boiled again. A plate set on a table that has seen too much. This is the beginning of after, when the last shot was fired, the last ration distributed, and peace signed in rooms far. From hunger, people went back to homes, to towns, to cities, missing street sand. They asked the same question everywhere: what is there to eat in Britain? The war had ended, but rationing had not. Meat was still scarce, butter, sugar, cheese, all controlled. All limited. Even into the 1950s, the Ministry of Food continued its broadcasts. Recipes for carrot cake without sugar, sandwich spreads made from mashed peas, and the eternal presence of powdered egg. British families had adapted to less, and now they had to learn how to wait even longer. Children born in peace still grew up on wartime diets. One mother wrote in her diary, I dreamed of a banana last night. Yellow, soft and real. It would be another year before she saw one again. Across Europe, the rebuilding began with bricks and bread. Germany, divided, bombed, and hungry civilians returned to cities that were rubble and cooked meals over stoves made from old tank parts. Watered down stew, black market potatoes, bread stretched with anything that could bind. If the occupying forces brought food and their own traditions, Americans distributed powdered milk-tinned meat, and Hershey bars. Children who had never tasted chocolate cried at the first bite because it was too much. Too sweet, too strange. In France, the post-war kitchens slowly returned to form. Farmers returned to their fields. Wine barrels were unburied, and cheese, that sacred birthright, came back to tables with reverence. But even then, it was cautious, smaller meals, fewer courses, a long road back to the elegance of before. In Japan, defeat brought devastation. Cities burned, fields, ruined markets, empty the government, and occupying. Americans began food distribution, rice, fish, tinned goods, school lunches, introduced bread for the first time in many children's lives, and soon the Japanese began to rebuild their food system with science, with planning, and with a quiet determination. In the Soviet Union, post-war years were marked by famine and scarcity. The land was vast, but the scars were deeper, collective. Farms were reorganized, grain was exported, while rural communities lived on beet soup and stale bread. Steel meals were made in small homes with shared ingredients. And the belief that survival was a form of victory. In the United States, the kitchen became a symbol of prosperity. The war had ended. Far from their soil, and food for many was now abundant. Supermarkets grew, cookbooks flourished, and processed food born of wartime necessity became permanent. Canned soup, frozen meals, powdered drinks, all stayed because they were fast, cheap, and familiar. Soldiers returned home craving the things they had missed, but also oddly craving the simplicity they had known. Spam stayed in pantries, instant coffee became a staple, and powdered eggs, surprisingly, were kept in some cupboards, just in case. In every country, food policy became central to peace. The Marshall Plan included flour, not just money. UN agencies distributed grain, milk, seeds. Victory gardens faded, but school lunches expanded. Nations learned that hunger was not just a wartime issue, it was political, global, and always waiting at the edge of chaos. So, food became a strategy. International agreements on grain, fertilizer, preservation, cooking, cultural restoration. Festivals returned with real butter, with full pies, with roasts that needed no substitutes. People cooked old recipes and cried not just for those lost, but for what had come back, because the meal, the real one with enough to go around, was the final victory. One spoonful at a time. Picture a kitchen with bright counters, glass jars filled with pasta bread sliced in plastic bags, microwaves, toasters, and snacks ready in seconds. It looks far from the trenches, from the black bread and powdered eggs, but much of what we see here came from war. During the World Wars, governments turned their attention to the science of food, how to store it, how to ship it, how to make it last. Canning exploded in popularity. What once required hours over a stove could now be eaten in minutes, from tins stacked like ammunition. And when the war ended, people didn't go back. Canned food stayed, not just because it was easy, but because it had become normal. Spam, canned beans, evaporated milk, all remained in kitchens across America, Britain, Asia, and beyond, because they worked, because they reminded people of survival in World War II. Powdered milk and dried eggs were military essentials, but they found their way into peacetime recipes. Pancakes made with dry mix, instant pudding, gravy from a sachet. These weren't seen as temporary, they became permanent, partly because people had learned to expect less, to cook creatively, to find comfort in the reliable. And so, the processed food industry was born. Campbell's soup, Kraft dinners, Nestle, powdered milk. Each product had wartime roots, and as factories adapted from tanks to toasters, food followed. In America, the wartime woman, taught to cook with coupons and ration stamps, became the peacetime housewife, taught to save time, stretch ingredients, use leftovers wisely. Cookbooks still carried echoes of those years. Recipes for mock meatloaf, rice bakes with canned vegetables, tips for storing flour in cool places just in case. Across Europe, the lessons of scarcity stuck. Children who grew up licking syrup tins became parents who told their own children to clean their plate, to never waste bread, to always keep a tin of something on hand. Even as prosperity returned, the habits remained. In Japan, post-war shortages shaped school lunch programs. Balanced Simple with rice, protein, and pickled vegetables, a model that still guides meals today in Germany. The memory of hunger led to a culture of efficient shopping, precise storage, and hearty meals made from scratch. Wasting food even now is seen not just as rude, but as dangerous. In the Soviet Union, the long lines and ration cards created a culture of bulk buying. Pickling, preserving a freezer always full, a cellar always ready, because history had taught that scarcity could return without warning. Kitchens around the world, wartime cooking taught invention, how to use beet juice for color, how to stretch soup with oats, how to turn yesterday's roast into today's pie. And these techniques didn't disappear, they became tradition casseroles. Shepherd's pie stews made from leftovers, all rooted in the same idea: make what you have last longer. Taste better. Wartime food also changed taste itself. People learned to enjoy simpler meals. Less salt, less sugar, more boiled, more baked. And some of these preferences never reversed. Even the global food supply changed forever. Rare dried noodles, long-life milk, vacuum-sealed packaging, all born from necessity, now found on every supermarket shelf. And with them, the unspoken memory that food is never just food. It is safety, it is memory, it is identity. And in the echo of every modern meal, there's a whisper from a grandmother who rationed sugar, from a grandfather who shared biscuits in a trench, from a mother who taught her children to never throw bread away. Now imagine the clink of a spoon, not a loud one, just a small sound like the world breathing again. The war's over, the uniforms are folded. The tanks rust in fields now full of wheat, but the people still cook, still eat, still remember, because every generation that survived the world wars carried the meals with them. Not just the food, but what it meant. A tin of beans wasn't just lunch. It was a miracle. A boiled potato wasn't plain. It was proof that you'd made it through. And so the stories remain told, not always with words, but with what was put on the plate. Father stirs porridge the way his mother once did in a blackout. A grandmother cuts carrots just like she did in a soup kitchen. A child asks why grandpa always keeps a tin of sardines in the cupboard, and the answer is because once he didn't have any. There's a kind of reverence, not for the food itself, but for the act of sharing it, because sharing meant survival. A crust passed hand to hand, a biscuit broken in two, a ladle dipped one more time into a pot that shouldn't have lasted this long. And now, decades later, we sit at tables in peace, in warmth, often in abundance, and still the ghosts of those wartime kitchens sit with us. The habit of saving scraps, the guilt of wasting, the pride in making something from almost nothing, not because we are still hungry, but because someone we loved once was history. In this way is quiet. It's not the headline, it's not the statue, it's not the treaty signed on thick paper. It's the grandmother who stretches stew, the child who licks the spoon clean, the neighbor who brings over bread just because it's in the smell of lentils boiling, the hiss of oil in a pan, the sigh of someone tasting something they thought they'd forgotten. And it's ingratitude, gratitude for food that arrives without fear, for kitchens lit by electricity instead of candles, for stoves that work in water that flows, gratitude for meals that aren't counted by rations, for meals that can be shared freely, for meals that end with full bellies and quiet hearts, because to eat in peace is to live in peace, and to remember those who did not is to keep them alive in some small way. With every spoonful, every shared plate, every help yourself, and have some more so tonight as you rest, as the noise fades and the long journey across trench and table ends. No, this, the story of food in wartime, was never just about war. It was about being human, being together, and finding comfort even when the world was falling apart. Food in the trenches of World War I and more, a journey through hunger, through ration books and refugee pots, through empty kitchens and meals made with memory. Thank you for walking with us, for listening quietly, and for honoring the stories behind every crust of bread. Rest well, and may your dreams be warm, safe, and full.